And now to today's program, actually. Today's special program is co-sponsored by the Anne Frank and the World Committee. I'd like to recognize Wendy Liebrick and several other members of the committee who are with us today. If they could stand, please, wherever they may be. There's Wendy. Anybody else is there? Yes. There are brochures outlining the exhibit schedule on the table at the back of the room, I hope. And I would encourage all of you to take advantage of these programs for the next month. Our board host today is seated at the head table, Susan Stone, down to my far right, a member of the Board of Governors. She's a principal with Stone Sheridan Group. She will ask the first question of our speakers. The second question will be asked by Martha Radakovich, who's a member of the Arts and Culture Standing Committee. We open the meeting up to questions from members after the speakers' prepared remarks, and I hope we'll get to those soon, so we'd better keep moving. Written questions will be asked as time permits. My daughter actually brought up the Anne Frank exhibit at dinner the other night, and she's 10, going on 17 in some respect. But she wanted to know how old Anne was and where she spent her time and how big the space was and what happened to her friends and did she have any friends and how lonely was it and how this could have happened to someone that could have been her classmate and how sad it made her feel. And she also talked about the risks that her friends took to protect and hide their friends and loved ones, and the courage that it took to act in the face of that danger. And I guess I feel that she has some greater appreciation now of the consequences of hatred in that time and the incredible loss of potential when children are murdered, but also, I guess, the hope when people speak out and act on matters of principle. So I think that the Anne Frank exhibit is a voice from another time, but obviously the parallels are clear. In two newspapers I read in the last 24 hours, I saw a state representative who received a viciously racist anonymous letter. I read that hate crimes are on the increase in this community. We have an environment of political cynicism and malaise, which engenders a lot of simplistic solutions. And we have ballot measure 9, of course. And our speakers today, I think, will discuss the present dangers that we face as a community and how we must remain alert to the threats that they present to us and our families. So I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Christopher Browning. He's a professor of history at Pacific Lutheran University, has been since 1984, Woodrow Wilson Fulbright Fellow, author of numerous publications, including Historians, Hitler and the Holocaust. And Mr. Bill Wassmuth, who's the executive director of the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment in Seattle. Previously, he was pastor of St. Pius X Parish in Coeur, Idaho. And the coalition, as you may know, has taken a position on the Oregon Citizens Affiance anti-gay initiative. So I'd like to introduce them both to you. Dr. Browning will speak first. Thank you.
Good afternoon. When I was asked to come down here, it wasn't at that point at all clear that ballot measure 9 would be a timely measure. It was not at all known or even imagined that David Irving would be in town. So I had not tailored my remarks for either event, but I instead wanted to step back a bit and try to put the issue of organized racism into a somewhat longer historical perspective. What I want to do briefly is simply to look at some parallels between the 1920s and 30s with what is happening in Germany today, with what is happening in the United States today. Let's look first of all at whatever parallels there might be in terms of the past situation and the present situation in Germany. We are all, of course, aware of the attacks upon the foreign workers and refugees in Germany and the visions that draws to mind. I think it's important to keep in mind that the rise of the Nazis took place in a framework or took place in a condition in which there was immense national humiliation, there was large-scale economic disaster, and there was very grave political instability. And all of this was borne by a society that had virtually no well-entrenched long-term democratic traditions. That it was very fertile soil indeed for a movement like the Nazis to be a catch-all protest movement to gather up the votes really very much across the whole width of society. The situation in Germany today, I don't think, is very parallel. Certainly Germany, with reunification, is at the height of its national success rather than national humiliation. It is the economic powerhouse of Europe and much of the world. It has, in the last 20 years, had exactly 3 chancellors and 2 governing coalitions, a remarkable legacy of political stability. So I think one would have to be, I would have to conclude quite simply that Bonn is not Weimar, that Germany is not on the brink of a Fourth Reich. There are 2 troublesome things that one can keep in mind that somewhat muddy that picture. And they're going to be a considerable source of alarm, I think, certainly over the next decade. One is, of course, the absorption of East Germany. That here is a subculture within the unified Germany that has experienced national humiliation, economic disaster, political instability, and is certainly a land without any well-entrenched democratic culture. They have in fact lived under various totalitarian dictators for the last 50 to 60 years. That is going to be hard to absorb. I think perhaps the analogy one might use is the Reconstruction in the United States after 1865. Here you have a land that has been on a different track, we might say, than the West. It is now suffering the deluge of West Germans coming to show them how to rebuild and to redo their society. There will be a subculture of resentment. There will, I think, be a large numbers of people who are simply thrown up in this period of instability that will provide the manpower for the riots, for attacks upon foreigners, refugees. But I think we should keep in perspective that this is still, however alarming and distasteful, this is still a long way from the 1920s and the early rise of Hitler. The second major element that certainly overlays the situation is the European-wide refugee crisis. Germany, being the most prosperous country in Europe and the one with the most open asylum and refugee laws, is only one of a number of Western European countries facing what many there look upon as a wave of refugees fleeing out of the collapsing economies of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. This, too, is very fertile political soil. One merely need to look at France, where Le Pen has gotten about 15% of the vote. If it wasn't for the fact that France has a somewhat different historical legacy than Germany, we would be thinking a lot more about it. You can imagine what we would be thinking if Le Pen were in Germany, but the French don't bear the same historical burden. In any case, then, I think, at least in terms of Europe, there is going to be the refugee crisis, and the anti-foreigner sentiment is going to be a very major strain of European politics in the next decade. That I, at the moment, think, however, it is going to be a problem that is surmountable. I wouldn't look at it as something that is, as some kind of European collapse. What about parallels with the United States? If Germany is not on the verge of becoming the Fourth Reich, what parallels exist between the growing hate crimes and racist movements in the United States and what the early years of the Nazis were in the 1920s? If we look back at the very early period of the Nazi rise, the period of 1919 to 1923, what we see really is a coalescence of 2 groups. On the one hand, there were the pseudo-intellectuals with their racist philosophies, what I might call the quacks. And on the other hand, there were the dislocated veterans coming back from the war, young students coming out that could find no jobs, who became the street fighters, the brawlers, what we might call the thugs. This alliance of the quacks and the thugs was really the core of the early Nazi movement, and that one can see some similarities too when you see the merger of skinheads with the earlier generation of racists, that kind of coalition that brings those 2 together is certainly in its incipient stages here. The real danger comes when it goes legitimate. That as long as it's mainly engaging in violence and street fighting and this sort of thing, it is going to be an assault upon the state, it is going to be an attack against authority, it is going to be offensive to the normal desire for law and order of most people, and certainly the Nazi movement found in the early 20s that it was not terribly attractive, that it could get a fringe vote, but it would remain a fringe phenomenon. After Hitler's attempt to seize power in Bavaria, the so-called beer hall putsch had failed, his lesson was go legal, go political, turn the Nazi movement away from being a group of brawlers who would hold meetings in various beer halls or tents and sort of dare anybody else to come and break them up looking for a street fight. I hope we keep that in mind tonight. Instead Hitler said, we will take power through the tactics of legality. We will become an electoral movement. We will go through the ballot box. Certainly measures like 9 and candidacies like David Duke indicate that there are some of that ilk that are indeed thinking of going legal and going political. And this has, in the long term, even if it is less sensational in terms of the news, even if it may present in the short term less danger to life and limb of those who are targeted, as compared to, say, the violence of the street fighters, it does have the possibility of becoming the nucleus around a catch-all kind of protest movement. When large numbers of people reach the point that they say, it can't get any worse, why not send a David Duke to the Senate? Or if they say, he's mellowed, things are more respectable, people will never do this kind of thing. When they're in power, they'll be tamed by power. These kinds of naive illusions, or people saying, well, I'm going to vote simply to send a message. When that mentality gets very widespread, and it combines with the racists who have gone respectable, have gone political, have gone legal, then indeed I think that one is at a point where all the warning lights should be flashing, where one should be very aware of what the potential is. We know what happens when these people get into power. Once someone like a Hitler gets into power, where he can use all the legitimacy of the government to legalize and authorize policies, where he can recruit and reward all the careerists who are simply looking for a fast track up, where he can exploit all the tendencies people have to be law-abiding citizens, to have deference to authority. Once these people are in, it is clear that it is already too late to do anything about it. So I would, in a sense, urge two things. One, that we always be aware, that we always are on the lookout, that we're always looking for the warning signals. On the other hand, I would say that we don't get hysterical, that we don't panic, that we keep things in an historical perspective to try to get some measured judgment of, in a sense, at what stage or what degree the threat may be. As I would say, I'd say we are approaching danger signals. We can see that developments are at the point that we certainly have to track them. They certainly must be fought. They certainly must mobilize us to vigilance. I wouldn't push the panic button, but I certainly think that one must be alert. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you all very much for inviting me here this afternoon. I consider it an honor and a responsibility to have the opportunity to share some thoughts and some information with you, especially at this particular time of this particular year when there are obviously a bazillion issues that you deal with and that come before all of us and demand our attention. I'm currently director, as I was introduced, of the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment. That's a coalition of organizations in the 5 states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. We came together beginning in 1987 to address the problem of malicious harassment based on race, religion, and sexual orientation. We provide resources and leadership to community organizing to oppose bigotry on grassroots level. We monitor incidents of malicious harassment. We monitor supremacist groups and individuals. We share that information as needed. We work for appropriate legislation and for the just enforcement and implementation of the laws that are established in these 5 states. And we provide education for young people and adults as well. One of the major educational efforts is our annual conference, which this year will be held in Eugene, not this weekend, but the next weekend. There's some information about that conference on the table over there, as well as copies of our newsletter and some additional information about the coalition if you're interested. And I certainly invite you as individuals or as groups and organizations to which you might belong, or as businesses as well, to become a part of the coalition. If you're a member of the coalition, that enables you to maintain an involvement in the work of opposing bigotry on a region-wide level, and it also strengthens us as we work in a united front to attack the problems of bigotry throughout the Northwest. End of the commercial. I don't have to go into a lot of detail to attract your attention to the importance of this issue. You know the strong KKK presence in Oregon some decades ago in the 20s and 30s. You know about the Posse Comitatus forming in this state in the 60s, the activity of that group, particularly in the Midwest during the 80s and the Farm Belt crisis. You know about the activity of the Order, that splinter group off of the Aryan nations that in the early 80s committed crimes of murders and bombings and robberies. You know about the racist skinhead activity starting here in Portland in the mid-80s, and maybe reached a high point with the murder of Mulugeta Serra in 1988. And you've heard, I'm sure, too, about the recent murders by the racist skinheads in Salem, just September 26th of this year. And while slightly different, because no one yet has been arrested, and because there's no direct ties to members of supremacist groups or hate groups, you know also about the vandalism and the threats of the Metropolitan Community Church and of St. Matthew's in Hillsborough just in the last few days. But beyond these well-documented and well-reported incidents lie many more incidents of malicious harassment. 488 incidents in the state of Oregon that are documented by the Law Enforcement Reporting Agency for the state of Oregon in 1991. And that number includes 176 assaults. 319 of those incidents are in Multnomah County for 1991. And if the current statistics are any clue, we're going to see an increase in that number in 1992. There's no question that we have a serious and growing problem, as these numbers indicate, and they're only one such indication. Hate and hate-based violence are out of the bottle in Oregon, as they are in other parts of the Northwest and in other parts of the country. Racism in its most extreme and radical form is white supremacy. And I don't mean to imply by my remarks that supremacy is the major issue when we deal with racism. Rather, I see that as being the tip of the iceberg. It's serious and it's visible, but it's really the indication of something much more beneath the surface. It is the institutionalized racism and bigotry and the prejudicial attitudes that are just below the surface in mainstream society that have much more of a chance to shipwreck our journey toward justice than do a small handful of supremacists. But by looking at supremacy, by viewing this extreme, maybe we can develop some insight into the broader picture. So first of all, just who are some of these people in this movement of white supremacy? They are the young, the racist skinheads and others, alienated and angry youth, idealistic, often violent, intent on taking by force what they feel is being denied them, or even worse, what is being taken away from them. It's a relatively small number of hardcores. We're talking hundreds in the Northwest, not thousands. But there are more wannabes, and there are some tag-alongs. Who are the people in the movement? They are the advocates of social revolution, the White Aryan Resistance, war, Tom Metzger and his group, still around and functioning even after the loss of that civil suit several years ago. It's Ricky Cooper and the National Socialist Vanguard and the Dows. It's those who want society to be formed their way, who want power in their hands and aren't willing to listen to any kinds of compromises. Who are the people in this movement? They're the tax protesters, Christian patriots in Boring, Citizens Bar Association in Medford, Posse Comitatus in rural areas. Adults with various degrees of involvement and racist commitment who share a common disdain for the government that they perceive to be illegal because it is not in accord with the original intent of the framers of the Constitution. Their goal is, one way or another, to bring the government down, some by not paying taxes, others by tying up the court system, all by organizing some kind of a resistance. Who are they? They are anti-Jewish. Almost all of the supremacists are first and foremost anti-Jewish. Anti-government people because they believe that the Jewish people control the government, Zionist-occupied government, Zog. Or economic people because they believe that there's an international Jewish conspiracy controlling the finances of the world and especially of this country. Or Christian-based supremacy because the Jewish people are obviously not Christian. Who are these folks? Some of them are political. Professor just referred to David Duke. Others are starting to enter into the political realm as well. Thomas Robb, the head of the Klan, pledged to create 1,000 David Dukes throughout the country. But more immediate for this election, Bo Gritz, presidential candidate on the Populist Party, a populist party which simply can't shake its ties to racist and supremacist movements and organizations. Who are they? Christian identity believers. From Randy Weaver in northern Idaho, who held his family at bay and put them in harm's way in northern Idaho a month or so ago, to a Christian Identity College in southwestern Oregon, 13 other organizations in the state of Oregon as well that are known to be based on Christian identity theology, and there are others that we don't know about. Christian identity is racism and bigotry based on Scripture and on Christianity. It's racism in the name of God, and perhaps the most difficult form to oppose. Aryan Nations, under the leadership of Richard Butler, is maybe the most well-known preacher of Christian identity in the Northwest because of his promotion of the Northwest as a white Aryan homeland where only Christian, according to his definition Christian, white folks would be able to be welcome. Richard Butler, by the way, is in no way the threat today that he was in the early 80s. His leadership has been seriously declining during the last few years, in part due to strict law enforcement when criminal activities are committed, and also due to serious community activity, particularly in that area. However, a serious concern at this time is the aftermath of the Randy Weaver standoff in North Idaho some 6 weeks ago, because the various supremacist groups are again coming together under some new and even more dangerous leadership than that of Richard Butler. The adrenaline is running high at the present time. We're most likely going to be seeing some more acting out and some more violence during these next couple of months. So a very brief overview of who are the white supremacists. And what does their extremism, what does their racism look like? Well, it's obviously exclusive. It excludes people, individuals, and groups of people from what they define to be normal. It promotes superiority. That's what supremacy means. One group is better than others. It's divisive. It divides groups of people amongst each other, and it promotes divisions where they already exist and exacerbates them. It promotes misinformation in order to justify positions. And thank God for the Anne Frank Museum being in this area at this time to provide some accurate information about the Holocaust during World War II times. White supremacy tends toward violence, or at least in most cases provides the foundation from which racist violence springs. White supremacy in many cases is God-driven. It's convinced that its view is the only possible view because it's the one that comes directly from God. Any other interpretation of what God wants or wills is invalid, according to their minds. It denies justice and freedom to some in our society, and it picks and chooses who those are who are denied those rights. And it demands its self-determined share of the pie. In the face of increasing population and decreasing resources, it demands for itself rather than work cooperatively with others. The cry that is heard in some cases from supremacy's lips is, if I can't have it, no one can. Very briefly, that's what supremacy looks like in the Northwest today. So what does it have to say about the rest of society? Remember my starting point, that white supremacy is only the tip of the iceberg. and it's supported by what's below the surface. What's below the surface is often subtle, often hidden, and frequently much more dangerous because it is subtle and hidden. I don't have time to draw this out in detail, but just to help the thought process get started, let me just offer some of the following ideas. Exclusive. All too often in mainstream society, we keep certain groups on the outside. Women by using sexist language. Cultures by establishing one culture as more valuable than others in school curriculums, or promoting English-only language frequently, just to mention a few examples. Divisive. If you want a prime example of a mainstream way to divide people and to exploit divisions that already exist, I would suggest you just simply listen to Pat Buchanan's speech in Texas a month or so ago. Or this written statement from Pat Robertson recently, in which he asserts that the feminist agenda is about, and I quote, a socialist, anti-family political movement that encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, and destroy capitalism and become lesbians. That's not an off-the-cuff remark on his part. That's a written statement in a fundraising letter. Now, I would suggest that that is about as divisive as it is possible to be in one simple sentence. In terms of denying justice, the war on drugs in our country that disproportionately concentrates on blacks and Hispanics, or prison terms that statistically are longer for people of color violators who are perpetrators of similar crimes and with similar histories, or misinformation to maintain oppression. The misinformation about the Native Americans that has been promoted for 5 centuries and continues even today, as evidenced by some of the recent discussion around Columbus Day, or the misinformation of the Holocaust revisionists. Supremacy. Sexual harassment is a power move. It's a way to maintain supremacy, one sex over another. God-driven. Just look at the abortion fight. All too often that fight gets down simply to my contact with God's desire on this matter is more accurate than yours. Or I don't want to hear yours, or even grant it any kind of slightest chance of validity because mine comes straight from God. There are many more examples, and I leave you to think about your own experiences in your own context. But I am sure that all of you, as you think about your own experience and your own context here in Oregon, would conclude that you need to consider these matters as you consider ballot measure 9. And I very much approve and support your decision on opposing ballot measure 9 in this state, because it raises a lot of these issues that I have talked about just briefly. Divisive, denying justice and freedom to some in our society, based on misinformation, supremacy, God-driven, misdirected fear and anger, exclusive. So supremacist activity and our own everyday experience. I don't mean by any means to oversimplify this issue by the way I framed my remarks today. There certainly is a difference between organized supremacy, which is a clear and organized plan to have one group dominate another, and individual acts of harassment or discrimination or a racial joke. The murders in Salem are different from denying someone housing or a job based on race, color, sexual orientation, handicap condition, etc., etc. But in terms of the impact on victims and in terms of the destructiveness to our society, the difference I suggest is one of degree, not one of fundamental difference or direction. The challenge to all of us is to deal not just with the tip of the iceberg, but to deal with the submerged portion of bigotry that can destroy us as individuals, that seriously harms its victims through continued oppression, and that can tear apart our country. The challenge for us is to work on this issue throughout our lives, where we worship, where we work, where we play, where we live, in all of our contacts, to work to make a difference for justice. An immediate challenge for you here in the state of Oregon is ballot measure 9. People in Oregon must vote on that ballot measure not based on fear, misinformation, or any of those other factors that I mentioned, but vote rather, as you must vote on other issues as well, on what accomplishes justice for all the people of this society. And after this election day, no matter which direction ballot measure 9 goes, all of us are going to be called upon to work on a healing process. Much healing needs to be done because hate is out of the bottle in Oregon as it is out of the bottle in other places of the Northwest and the country, and it won't go away on its own. It'll only go away when we work together to eliminate it. So again, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to our dialogue.
I think our speakers have done a wonderful job of identifying what hatred, discrimination, bigotry looks like. My question is, as we all walk out of here today, what can each one of us do to help stop hatred, stop discrimination, and stop bigotry?
Well, as Bill said, one is
Dr.
vote.
Browning.
and vote, I would urge as he recommended. That would certainly be the first immediate step. I think, of course, the other responsibilities lay in terms of how we raise our kids, how we influence our educational system, how we participate in the political system. Democracy is not a thing that you simply achieve and then coast on. It is an ongoing process. It is a way in which one lives day after day. And it never comes to an end in which you say, well, we've got it and now we don't have to do anything more. So I guess I would say the main thing is to simply be aware that there is no end to this. It is an ongoing way of life. It is an ongoing commitment. And that this is the burden and the cost of what it means to try to live in a democratic and free society.
I would only add to that I think we all need to start with looking at ourselves too, because we are all part of a society that still contains within it bigotry and racism. And whether we choose it or not, and hopefully most of us would not choose it, it affects us. We grow up with the attitudes that were given to us as children. We grow up surrounded by the attitudes that are placed upon us by the media and by those around us. And unless we continue to be critical of ourselves, we will fall into the trap of pointing fingers elsewhere without recognizing some of what's happening in our own lives.
Thank you for your presentation. Do you think that the press publicize, stimulate, and alter the judgment of people in our city who harass, bomb, deface property, and kill? You know, there is a group that might read of someone else defacing or altering the temple or a church, and they would turn to themselves and say, well, I haven't done that, therefore I'm not that bad. The mentality of I'm not that bad, I haven't done that yet, is very real in a certain group of people. Also, speak to me of action. What can I do? What can I do besides write a check to charity, go to vote, and join the coalition? What can I do? I walk out of here in Portland to change from the banner of hate to a banner of mutual justice. Resentment with reason, and replace humiliation with hope.
Let's try to, that's a couple of questions at least. Who wants to take a shot at that?
Okay, I'll start this
Mr.
one.
Wassmuth, go ahead.
Let me start with your first one. The constant battle or challenge in terms of should publicity be given to acts of harassment when they are committed, that it might enable people to find scapegoats. Look how bad those folks are. I'm not that bad, therefore I'm not a racist. I don't have anything to do on my own. That was what I was trying to point out in my presentation, that we need to be very careful that while we look at the supremacists and understand them, that we don't somehow give them sole ownership of the problem of racism. They're only the worst tip of the iceberg. And if we look at them, we need to look at them in order to better understand what's happening throughout our society. Back to your question of what can we do? Certainly the things that were suggested already. Vote, that's one most important thing. But we can also work at creating atmospheres and work at creating environments around us, whether that's where we work, whether that's with our friends, whether that's in our families, whether that's in our place of worship, whether that's in a group like you have here today. Individually and as organizations, we can create those kinds of tones. We can change around the drift. It's kind of that critical mass movement, if you want. We've done it with smoking cigarettes, for example. There was a time when all of a sudden it switched to where it is no longer that socially acceptable to smoke. 15 years ago, it was very socially acceptable. That was done one move at a time. It's a distorted version of that 100th monkey, if you want. Each one of us doing our part, and eventually we create a critical mass that moves in the direction of justice and opposes bigotry and racism. We can all figure out how we can work best in that in our own individual lives and with our own individual contexts.
Dr. Browning, you have briefly, we have to wrap.
Yeah. I've just written a book called Ordinary Men, and it has been criticized by some because they don't like to read the book and have it suggested that if they look in the mirror, they can also see an ordinary man. The book is about a killer battalion of ordinary middle-aged Germans that were sent to Poland during the Holocaust. Some of the criticisms were, well, that wasn't ordinary men, it was ordinary Germans, or they're psychopaths. I don't think we can afford that kind of complacency. I think you're perfectly right that we do have to come to grips with what is a potential in human beings, that most of us are capable of a great deal of violence under certain circumstances, and that complacency and self-satisfaction are what have to be fought as well.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you all. I would urge you to participate again in the Anne Frank activities over the next 3 weeks. Involve your children if you can. I think one of the messages of that exhibit and one of the messages today is that this is for the youth of our community, if for no one else. I also think it's an opportunity for us to recommit as a community to some positive human values that have been referred to, and I think we'll all be stronger as a result of that commitment. So thank you all for coming.